One thing that people will say is that imperialism never ended. The author was the first woman professor of women's studies in the Divinity School of Harvard. This book is about how politics and certain stages of life form an identity. Racial and national identity set people apart. And just like a book that I am sharing from somebody who later became a leader of the National Association of Colored People, people may not realize how they're raised that they are considered as part of one group or another. Some people do become possessed in their artistic expression. Our artistic expression happens during what Islam and other faiths would consider forbidden practices. But it may not be the spirits that are doing the work. Our own bodies, our own psychology may be what's responding. Religion and other systems of judgment, deen as it's called in Arabic, can be understood through the fact that others respond to things. And how are they responding? It turns out that the feminist movement isn't quite doing what people think it is doing for women. And I admit that I would have had some misconceptions, but reading the Bible, I knew what a lot of the view of women was in the West. I knew how people reacted. And I didn't really have much of this idea that women are treated worse over there. The written word is just as subject to changes and fabrications and such as oral tradition. In fact, a lot of what we see is even more worked away from the truth, whether we're talking about straight up fiction or stuff that doesn't present itself that way. But the idea that you can't trust word of mouth and that sort of stuff, that does have an effect. But if you can't trust word of mouth, how can you trust those that wrote down word of mouth? Of course, Islam has combined the strength of both to a degree that unless you know about it, you wouldn't expect it. How meticulous the narration chains are regarded, that it automatically takes from a person's ability to testify if there's any question about their honesty. Islam doesn't allow anybody to lie to make a joke. It does blame the persecutors for those that feel coerced to a certain degree or threatened or whatever you're going to call it into doing something that is otherwise contrary to their faith. It puts the blame on not those people, but the people that are the persecutors. But lying to outsiders and other stuff like this is just not principles that they have. So therefore, it just imbibes a certain level of honesty to begin with. And the degree of verification of what's said is a lot higher than you would expect from the Western tradition in written words, or what's typically in the Eastern tradition as well. For us telling the human story, it's important that we use different sorts of techniques in relating things. That between categories of life, as much as religion is meant to be a relationship with it all, we can distinguish what's economic, the material and psychological culture, the politics, the organizational aspect of religion versus the religion itself. A lot of the rulings may be almost completely sound, and most of them can be universal and all that stuff, but you need to distinguish between that and the fundamentals. And, well, what's the difference with the liberals as something other than just something that you call some other political group? What's the difference there? It's important that we regard ourselves as being of more than one category and realize that. And it's not just autistic people that should be figuring that out too. The idea of someone merely being traditional or conservative, you'll look at that differently as you go on in your life. Different groups of people will give you standards by which to judge them in a way that perhaps some of the IQ test shouldn't have. It's like, well, if I tested as 158 with all those questions about New York culture and stuff that I did not care about and did not spend my time with, what would have been the case if I had been informed? What would have been my results then? What would have been my results if I lived somewhere where less of the questions that they determine IQ with? So some of that stuff should be put in the cultural and psychological, the material and psychological culture that a person taking it would actually be in. And, well, one of the things with psychologists is they say, well, what do we think is popular? And therefore it's like, oh, I don't want to have to know what Jay-Z or Ye, is Ye the same person? No, I don't think Ye is the same person. Kanye West, yeah. Or I know who those people are, but I don't know anything about their music. I don't, there was a song that obviously I would have heard or two from Eminem, but I don't really know his methodology or anything like this. And there's questions that they may ask you about that, or some other pop star or something like this, or some television show that, it's just not in my ethics to follow along with something just because it's popular. And so therefore I'm considered not as smart as I would be if looked into in terms of my context. And the same goes with a lot of people, and certainly a lot of cultures are factions of culture, right? And one thing with books like this is people will identify, okay, I either had experiences like this or realizations like this, quite directly or indirectly, so in the same categories. So one of the reasons why books like this may be bigger than some of the books that I talk about and smaller than others will become apparent. Egypt, as far as anybody can remember, and that includes what you'd call cave art too, has been a mixing pot of cultures, a shifting place that things that happened long ago still affect how things are now and continue to shape how some things people think are part of the place inherently. They're actually part of things that have been brought in. The Zionist movement affecting things between the 1880s, when it first appeared, to the 1920s, where it had a bigger effect in Egypt than it did in the Holy Land, and to this day, where one of the families that was part of forming the IDF has been part of a government takeover. So a lot of people don't realize, those sort of influences. Our colonialism is over with, but then again, Egypt doesn't use most of its wealth. Most of its wealth goes to foreigners. America apparently gets most of the wealth of Egypt. How's that happen? There's a handful of African countries, and Egypt is one of them that, they're fighting for independence. Well, I mean, maybe not physically fighting necessarily, but, they want their independence, the people of Egypt do. Because they're just one of those African countries that doesn't keep most of its wealth for people of that country. And so the companies have carried on the whole colonial bit. And the politicians that are there at least have to deal with that and the other influence I mentioned. Because some of the technology has been something that appeared elsewhere, the fact that some of these modernities needed to be brought in the post-colonial period actually strengthened some of the hold, because certainly the modern technology has made it easier to take a higher percentage of the wealth of the people. You could take tribute, but you couldn't take away the basic subsistence farming and stuff, because most of that would still have to stay. But and the independent, so the cultural influences that have happened, like some of the laws that they try to blame on, the ways of this country, and some of that stuff could be ancient ways of that country, but a lot of it would have been stuff brought in through sensibilities and other aspects of the colonial raid, and now the corporate indoctrination. People want a return to the spirituality of their ancestors. They want the wonder and understanding and fulfillment that it seems to have granted of them. They also want some aspects of an age where music and stories and all that weren't just a thing of distraction, that they were at least cultural, even if sometimes they did deter from religion and things that needed to be done. And one of the cultural things that appears back and forth in different forms through all sorts of cultures, rather than just blaming it all on men, it turns out that just like men will do this to each other sometimes, there's whole chains or systems where the women oppress each other. And a lot of that can be seen, like in my culture, by how, like for example, modesty standards, even where there's that. Some women were really like, oh, you have to tie it a certain way, and it's their culture's way of tying it, and they just bring stuff in like that. Or, some women can tell the difference between like the outfit that you have there with the woman. Let's put this in Western ideas. Let's just say that's $30, and as a guy, maybe you couldn't tell the difference between the $15 and the $30 and the $3,000 version, unless silk or something showed up, you wouldn't be able to tell anything, but the women can tell. And some women insist on all this. In my culture, it's, again, fancy clothes that don't even cover, but they can tell them apart. And, well, I mean, they cover some, but, and oppressive routines of the hair and makeup and all this other, and all this other stuff that perhaps they need to go through, that's just, now they do show off for the guys, and they try to say, oh, I don't, it's not for the guys. It's like, yeah, more consciously it's for the girls. But then again, well, the women, they say girls, but the competition amongst them is really for their position in relation to the guys. That's really kind of what's going on. So, you can't all blame one side for these things. And as far as what Islam says, women have rights like unto men. And if you enumerate what's listed out, it can be harder to figure out how women don't have the upper hand versus the men, really, in terms of the conditions laid forth and all that. Just like the plants and the animals and the rocks will influence our sense of the world, so will the types of things that are made for a person locally. And people will be compassionate in regards to the difference that other people will have. Some people will rise and fall in society depending on the political and other movements. Some people will find a middle ground in the morals set forth by religion, the care for life being transferred over into different categories. People will be blamed by themselves or others for what was obviously not their fault, and that will have an effect. There's a difference between toleration and encouragement and excusing. Religion is more than institutions. It's more than ancestors. But our personal journey reflects on the things that these do exist. And in some way, they've been made a part of us. Fundamentals give possibilities, and these possibilities are not just something for one particular group. If we have a pure transmission like Quran, we need not confine it to any particular period or culture. We need to be wary of the sense of being kept apart. In what ways do we indulge it, and in what ways do we not take part? So much of our education is about nationalism, a nationalism which may shift from time to time. And especially if we consider the occupation of all our governments by a small group of individuals, the same families for hundreds of years, if not going back way further than that, at least 1611, been the same 212 plus 20 from the same family ancestral lines, with a hand in every major war, etc., etc. The nationalities that they've allowed us to have, well, education, how's the song go? We're not educated, we're just regulated. Things are not so secular now, but we find the look of the combination of God and government. Now, people aren't as foolhardy about the idea to just say, well, as long as it's the government, God must have agreed. No. People more and more, the further back you go, had this idea of the combination of the duties. You turn to deity as the ultimate of what government can only be a representative of, at best. July 26, 1952, changed some things in Egypt, and some of the patriotic songs of England and some other places kind of went away from as common of use, so not everybody knew them anymore. Palestine and other issues were part of the broader culture, but except for the role that Zionism played in the society and those in charge of how things were a lot of these things just seemed afar off. And in other ways, if you really think about it and you're a thinker and all that stuff, you always seem sort of far off from the other people. The Suez Canal was not the only example of something about Egypt that others wanted. And the internal conflicts of how to respond to the foreign demand or foreign claim or attempts to was certainly something that continued to stir up conflict. And you could say again that's another thing that continues to have effect. A lot will know that gypsy comes from the Greek agyptos, and words that relate to cleaning or traveling and that sort of stuff. So there's been this sense of this mystery that if you travel about and you have awareness of it, or the lowly worker will have knowledge of what is known, and so there's sort of that imbibing with the culture. Nowadays, people, there's so much history in Egypt, people find out about things. There's old tunnels and artifacts under people's homes that they keep secret, and they're impoverished, so what do you expect them to do except sell some stuff? And if Egypt, again, had most of its own wealth, then, a lot of this stuff wouldn't be directed towards happening. I'm not saying it's necessarily right for them to break the law or anything like that. I'm just saying, it's like this is why it's happening. And in a way, because of all the crusades and colonialism and now the corporate thing, it's like the Egyptians are being leased their own land back, and that they're told that their own culture isn't really theirs. Some areas have been more thoroughly directed that way to others. Oh, here's these ancient monuments, and to this day, despite all the archaeology and stuff, they still believe, the people do, the stories that the French and English and stuff told them, that the ancient culture of their land was really because the Europeans had came down and conquered them back then too. Socialism and nationalism and stuff step forward as causes. Revival of feudalism stuff steps forward as causes that aren't really the cause that they present to be. They come forward with some sort of value, and people latch onto that value like this is the only way you can get it. That's why people join cults, is because they're raised in a certain way with or without religion, and then they find something that has something that they're missing, and even overlook not only the problems, but what's missing from their new faith as well. Back to the subject of divination, before returning on the line where we just were on, right? there are predictive capabilities within us that are just below the surface. And if we focus on our dreams and some other stuff, with or without the involvement of spirits and stuff, which may just be working on a person's anxieties or sense of loyalty that will shift their spiritual alliances more than actually do anything for them. You know, those things can be evoked. Now, as far as what you would call Western religion or whatever, sound practices of divination, again, you can do your sleep, you can just tune your awareness without, and just be open to the fact that you may remember dreams and stuff, not, and make records of them. You don't have to, do anything that's per se forbidden, magic or whatever. And okay, back to the political thing, right? A lot of things present themselves like they're a movement and towards a direction. So not only the labels are wrong, and some aspects of it aren't quite as purely in the category as people think. Oh, socialism's the greater good, right? Well, in a sense, but is any system of socialism really totally about the universal good? Right? So a lot of things also, even when they're being honest, they're not there yet. It's a movement that if, then we would. We might want to distinguish between faith inflections by and for a group. Because what's best for a group may not be the long-standing traditional way, at least in some aspects. And there's what's directed by outsiders, per se. You look at what people like Theodore Herzl and stuff ended up saying about the Zionist movement. They literally wanted to infiltrate and replace the churches and synagogues and stuff. So it was, they knew it was separate than Judaism. But they wanted it to infiltrate and replace a lot of Western religion. People are part of the race they are part of. They are part of the nationality or tribe, or in the plural, if that's the case, that they come from. They are part of the continents that they've lived on. But what part do we identify with at what time? The rights of consent and maintenance and ability to be different, which traditional society and modern society really kind of doesn't like dissidents too much, to the point of even killing them in the street just for that, not even really technically breaking a ethical, let alone moral law. A lot of people, if they understood Islam, would be like, well, all this feminism stuff, it's not necessary, is it? But East and West, so outside of the actual religious culture, we find, and secular, the secular culture is what it is, we find that it was necessary, or is necessary at some times and places, for movements to focus on one gender's rights or whatever. Now, rights violations and stuff are a problem wherever they appear, but some of it does end up being big enough that you do have to lead to that. Now, America, you have the Civil Rights Act and stuff like this, and finally it's been more fully realized in doing away with the prejudice and placating on the other side as far as the federal system. From the older days of the big tent city to modern Cairo, one of the things that a person looks at is the ability of silence, the ability of the perception beyond all the noise and stuff. And that includes, a sensibility of being somebody that can be respected by all the groups. Not punishing people for disobeying some of the rules, or like in a real Islamic society, most of the rules are not enforced in that degree. They're just said, this is right and this is wrong, and, you choose. So we need to distinguish between that. And we need to distinguish also between those who are going to implement all sorts of penalties for these things. The person who increases the penalties according to the Islamic system or adds some, they are unjust. So modern secular society has really laid this down with so many laws and so many just not natural things. So if you don't learn them, you don't even know that they're illegal. Or they make these silly things like, if intoxicant use is only allowed for survival, not even for so-called comfort, which a lot of that turns out not to be true, then, those who are caught publicly using anything or publicly on anything, well, they're in the same boat, rather than this hypocritical thing that, some of them more than others, they get penalized and all this. Is like, yeah, if you force on others through smoke or something like that, then you're responsible for that. But there's a lot of laws that every society tends to have in this modern secular world that, doesn't do a lot of that stuff. And one of the things that sometimes women will understand more than men is the point is not to be reactionary. I have fulfilled a lot of requests to do videos on this channel, and I'm fairly certain in the future that I will continue to do so. But the point is not to be reactionary. It's to be beneficial. So all these people, will you condemn this? Will you encourage this? And it's like, either I'm already doing it, or why? Dude, are you not paying enough attention? I'm already encouraging and discouraging a lot more than you realize. There are dictators to be overthrown. There are companies to reform. There are workers that need a higher share of the benefit of their land, of their work. The difficulties of questioning can be surmounted. The difficulties of things that may not have been done. The difficulties of not knowing what is possible, but going forward just the same. These things can be surmounted. The ordinary can become dominant. The extraordinary can inform what that dominance should be. We can go beyond fear